Wyoming Stable Token is issued by Wyoming as a sovereign entity, right? It is the state of Wyoming doing the issuance. It's not a Wyoming bank. It's not a Wyoming trust. It is the state. That means we are only realistically overseen by the federal government and whatever rules they have in place that would govern or oversee states. As it is written, it is not our opinion that the Genius Act is applicable to the Wyoming Stable Token Commission or a Wyoming stable token. That is due to how issuers are defined, particularly as people in the Genius Act. And people are banks, trusts, fintechs, and other business entities. Nowhere in there does it say state or sovereign entities.
You're listening to Season 6 of Stableminded, powered by Rain. Rain helps financial teams build and manage stablecoin-powered card programs. With a single API, Rain lets you issue branded cards and unlock new revenue. With Rain, users can move, store, and spend stablecoins instantly and compliantly in over 150 countries. Join us this season to explore how Visa, Crossmint, Yellow Card, Arculus, and the state of Wyoming are embedding stablecoin flows into their business. You can learn more at rain.xyz. Anthony, Apollo, so excited for you to be joining us. Thank you so much for taking the time. How's it going today?
Busy. We've got a lot going on with the Stable Token Commission. We're coming off of a holiday weekend, but formally back at it now.
You've been building pretty publicly. How long has it been you've been doing Wyoming Stable Token Commission now?
It's a good question. That kind of leads us right into the history, which I'll give you the top level of, and then we can always dig into it. But the Stable Token Act was passed in March of 2023 in the state of Wyoming, and that was already downstream of several years of work by the legislature on it. There was some preliminary work done by the commission. I came on board in September of 2023, so this is going to be about my 2-year anniversary on the job. I was a sole resource for the first year, so I was literally running the agency by myself. And I will add that's as someone with no government experience. I'm coming from a combination TradFi and crypto startup world. I'm like a day walker in that capacity. And then we were able to bring the team on board, and with the team on board for about a year now, we've got the Frontier Stable Token live on several interoperable blockchains. We'll have some partners on board to demonstrate how citizens can get a Wyoming stable token and how they can use them.
Yeah. We're sort of in the thick of you guys coming out with a lot of the news. We've been covering a lot of the FRNT token and just the news with like the certain infrastructure partners you all have chosen to work with along the way. And we'll get into all of that. I think I'm just really excited to better understand how this all came to be. I think of what you're doing here as a really unique framework or recipe that other states could consider going through. We've personally been, I'm based in St. Louis, Missouri. I love Missouri. We've been in touch with some, Missouri legislators and state senators who are very interested in like learning from you and learning around what you're doing here. So why don't we just take a step back as we begin? I'd love to hear more of like your personal journey of how you got involved with this to begin with. Like when was the first time this came across your radar? I'm looking at your background. Looks like you were doing some crypto native stuff at Consensus. Just give us an overview on your history as we get going.
Yeah, just take it one step back, even before the Consensus days. I started my career in traditional finance, very much a child of the 2008 global recession, went into accounting rather than finance. And that meant I got put on a bunch of clients that were big banks, the GSIBs, helping them update their regulatory reporting in the wake of the passage of the Dodd-Frank Act. You get into these banks, you see how the sausage is made, you see antiquated infrastructure, you see a lack of technical upkeep, and technical debt keeps creeping up. And at the exact same time, this has been fall of 2015, I learned about Bitcoin and I learned about Ethereum, which had just launched, and pretty immediately started trending in that direction with my career. Ended up joining Consensus in 2017 to work on a project called Solarius. That was an extremely early attempt at tokenized intellectual property. We built a whole science fiction universe about a artificial intelligence that becomes self-aware in the year 2084. And it was really the struts of this sci-fi world. And then we were looking to tokenize all of the IP around it that users could create. So it's kind of like an early UGC model. There's governance tokens. There was going to be IP tokens. There was going to be just your standard, ERC20s to facilitate payments and royalties. And I should note, this is all the time that CryptoKitties had just launched and gunked up the Ethereum network. So We were, as someone later put it, terminally ahead of schedule. We were way too early in that one. Fast forward a couple of years, I continued working on kind of those tokenized IP projects. I worked on a program called Rensa, which was doing digital multimedia and like real-time payouts to content creators. And at one point, even worked with an NBA athlete on a compliant debt security token that we issued here in the US. That was Spencer Dinwiddie, then of the Brooklyn Nets, now in the Charlotte Hornets. We did a tokenized bond, essentially backed by his NBA contract, personal guarantee, endorsement deals, all that kind of stuff, that had stablecoin payouts on a monthly basis to those investors who held the tokenized bond. So I've been in this for a while. I moved to Wyoming in September of 2021 because of the extremely permissive legislative framework they've created around digital assets, which goes back several years. I'll talk more about that probably in a second. But just got involved with that process. It's small government. It's a very agile government. If you come to the meetings, you show up, you become a familiar face, you make, testimony that's, well informed, which means like if the legislature is drafting bills and you have like some, kind of tactical commentary, they're all ears for it. People will show up with like, dossiers they want to read off. That's not really the same. But if you just become a familiar face and you can kind of get involved, that's what I did. And then when the Stable Token Act passed, they needed an executive director to run it. And they needed someone with a combination of banking experience, securities law, product development, blockchain, lived in Cheyenne. I could start a new job the next day. And in a town of 60,000, it kind of stuck with me.
Wow. So you ended up moving to the state and feeling like this was a place where legislation was able to get passed quickly, effectively. People could actually hear and receive new ideas. Tell us a little bit about, for those who aren't, legislative experts or know much about what Wyoming has done. I'd love, you kind of already guessed where we were going there, but like, give us a sense of how Wyoming might compare to other states, or maybe some of these things that they've uniquely implemented in the last few years of leading up to this moment we're in now.
Sure. So I think one of the important things to note is Wyoming's efforts in kind of like the Web3 industry writ large go back about 10 years, 2016, when there were people in the state who wanted to buy Bitcoin, but via some local quirk of the Uniform Commercial Code, they weren't able to open exchanges here and people couldn't buy Bitcoin. So then it went down the track of like, okay, what do we need to do to update our laws in the books? And that kind of started this whole process. But since 2016, 80 bills have been put forward and 50 of them have been enacted that cover the whole gamut of how you handle digital assets, right? So stable token is just one piece of all this. We've got privacy provisions that prohibit the disclosure of your public keys in a civil or criminal proceeding. Protect under the First Amendment, right? We can't compel speech as a state. There's new business entities like the DAO LLCs and the DUNAs, the decentralized, unincorporated, nonprofit associations, of which Uniswap just voted to become one and then relocate and redomicile in Wyoming as a the ability to pay your taxes with crypto, a digital asset registry in the Secretary of State's office. All of these were either to make business easier or to try to generate new revenue streams in the state. Because Wyoming is an oil and gas state, highly fossil fuel dependent. At some point, those resources dry up. What comes next? Well, digital assets could be one way, especially considering that Wyoming created the LLC back in the late 70s, or at least in the US, before Delaware kind of ran with the better marketing. So there's a lot of exploration around new filings, new entity types, and just creating registration fees for that. That's one reason the Stable Token Act came around, was to kind of be the glue, to cohesive wrapper around all these different and disparate initiatives in the state in which you may want to transfer value between them, right? If you're generating revenues off of a digital asset you've registered in the Secretary of State's office, you want to pay taxes with those revenues, right? It's easier if it's all in one digitally native and stable asset. State stable token makes sense. I already touched on the revenue generation potential. It's important to note that the Wyoming stable token, or again, we'll call it now the Frontier stable token, is backed by cash and a very short-term and conservative blend of US Treasuries. Those are interest-bearing, so those dollars come back to the state, and specifically the school foundation fund is a way to diversify revenues in the state. And the final note is, on the Stable Token Act specifically, it's kind of a second attempt by the state at a fully reserved financial instrument. So many of your listeners and yourself probably know about the special purpose depository institutions like Custodia. Kraken is also one. Caitlin Long runs Custodia. She's a big name in this kind of space here and local. The SPDIs were never really able to get off the ground as they should have been because of pressure from the previous presidential administration. And that's pretty clear at this point in time if you've watched kind of look at all the documents that have come out as a result of that. It's always an interesting model because it was a way for banks, or financial institutions rather, to custody digital assets, provided they were 100+% reserved. I mean, there was a lot of time and effort went into that, a 770-page exam manual, years of work, only to be kind of deflated by the prior administration. So this is really a second attempt with the stable token at a fully reserved financial instrument because we believe that there's demand for that.
Yeah. From your vantage point, as you've been involved in the prior administration and the new one, could you give I mean, I've been listening to Caitlin Long on podcasts for years talking about like the journey of getting that approved and all of the intensity around what she believes to be true around that. And it was always really shocking to see just the continued delay of something like that. Maybe from your perspective, from your vantage point, what has it been like being involved in this like choke point era to now? Like, how does it feel, boots on the ground there, and how would you compare and contrast what has actually happened since that time? Whether that's like sentiment or companies who are starting or entering or coming back. What have you seen? It feels like such a big shift.
I think it's been a complete 180. To speak for myself personally, as someone who's been in this industry as long as I have, I mean, the debanking stuff is still a problem. I mean, I mentioned Solarius earlier. I won't name the bank. We, at a point in early 2018, our CEO went out, opened a bank account. By the time he came back to the WeWork, the bank account was already like frozen. So they approved it, got it off, and then froze it immediately. And then we didn't hear back for months as to like the status of that, where the money was, where we could put it, right? So I knew these problems for years. And if you work for a company that's even tangential to digital assets, I mean, there's no shortage of banking relationships where every single payment is frozen, every single wire is frozen. You got to get a call with someone every time. You know, they can't explain to you why your money can't move around. And that caused a lot of frustration, and stable coins are an answer to that. I'd also add, you know, part of the reason why I moved to Wyoming to build Rentsa, the previous platform, was because of what they call the fintech sandbox here. It was a way for companies to kind of play around with different tokens, different instruments that may or may not have securities like properties to them, at least within the state level. If you keep in the state, we're going to give you a little bit of time to play around. I think it was a 2-year limitation on your ability to issue assets. And for us, we were looking into that because royalty streams are typically not securities to my knowledge, but if you start essentially carving them up and making them financial instruments, they can kind of mutate into securities. So we wanted to kind of test that in the fintech sandbox here. Never really got that off the ground because I've taken this role on. But you know, when I have those conversations, think about how much trepidation there was and kind of walking on eggshells versus where we are now, where crypto was a pretty large determinant, in my personal opinion, of the most recent election. And now the pendulum has swung so far the other way. We have USD1 launching and being made available for transfer on Labor Day, talking about the ability for stable tokens to move on holidays, even when your banks are closed. So I think we've had a huge swing of the pendulum. I'm very happy to see that a lot of these documents around debanking and a lot of the investigations are kind of ongoing. You know, that was something that people like Nick Carter were talking about for years, had massive implications for Silvergate and Silicon Valley Bank. You know, Caitlin Long has been talking about for years, and I've seen in my personal life, in my own startups. So none of it's lost on me that we've gone really in the other direction. I think just to put a cap on it, I'm most excited to see innovation come back on shore from stablecoin specificity, right? We saw a lot of companies leaving like Agora and Mountain, going to the Bahamas, Bermuda, or, you know, to achieve a yield-bearing stable token that essentially could distribute yield in US dollars based on US debt, but it wasn't available to actual US citizens. It's kind of a broken model. So I hope that changes soon and we could be a part of that change with the Frontier stable token. And then, you know, I've heard numbers, let's say, and these are probably swag, but, you know, 2% of developer talent leaving every year because of these problems. Every year for the last 10 years, well, a compounding problem, that's 25 to 30, right, of your developer talent has now gone offshore. And you want those people here building in the US. So I'm very excited to see a lot of the positive and proactive changes. Very happy to see all the results that have been achieved by groups like the Digital Chamber and the Blockchain Association, and look forward to more good work happening, especially around the market structure bill. I'm a big fan of what Senator Lummis has put forth with the Responsible Financial Innovation Act, and hope that goes the same way as the Genius Act did.
Can you describe that specifically? I'm not as familiar with that one with Senator Lummis.
So the Genius Act passed, right? But there was kind of this debate between which version of the stablecoin bill, the stable or the Genius, would go through, and Genius kind of won out. But now there's a push for a broader market structure bill. That'll do things like define assets more robustly, delineate responsibilities of oversight, particularly between the SEC and the CFTC. So the RFIA is something that Senator Lummis worked on several years. I know the team at DLX Law worked on that as well. I had worked with them on that, the security token deal I had mentioned earlier. So I was always kind of following closely. They do things like define tokens as, this could be an ancillary asset. There's always different definitions in there that I always think is critical to any kind of new or upcoming industry about using the same vernacular. And I think the RFIA bill does a great job of that. And I hope to see that one get carried forward. Because just to give you an example, there's been a lot of questions about whether Wyoming will try to issue a yield-bearing stable token. I have personally voiced my support for that. We have a letter from the legislature and particularly the Legislative Services Office that says they are of the belief that we could issue a yield-bearing stable token with our current structure. Further investigation, of course, required, but that's on the docket. I bring all that up because when we think about a yield-bearing stable token, and I say that to people, they don't know what that means because it could be any one of three things. It could be kind of a pass-through or a native yield where we're just taking some percentage of the interest income we're earning on those treasuries and just passing that along. That's what I think we would do. That's in opposition to, let's say, protocol yield, right? We're not taking Wyoming stable tokens or any kind of native currency and staking it to secure a network, at this point at least, to generate some kind of yield and then pass that on to a holder of a Wyoming stable token. Nor are we doing what, as I understand it, Circle does, which is sends USDC over to Coinbase. Coinbase invests that, invests USDC that someone else is holding in a custodial account, and then they give you 4.95% on, a recurring basis. Kind of like profit-driven yield that's being invested somewhere else that kind of starts to look a little bit like the fractional lending model we have in the big banks. I think we need to be very particular about the language we use, and I would hope that some of the market structure bills, no matter which one it is, goes a long way towards rectifying that.
Yeah, it's really helpful to differentiate. Language is so important. And given our seat in the industry, it's something that we just want to continue to get better at, is like talking about these things more in a more calculated way, in a more specific way, because those nuances are really key. Touch on a little bit of just the, with Genius passing, what that's unlocked, but also what continues to perhaps still be uncertain when it comes to things like yield generation for a state, state-powered stable token like this. What sort of nuances there are you thinking through? What does Genius, what does or does it not cover in regard to specifically Wyoming as a state versus the federal level? Would love your thoughts on that. I think a lot of states, again, Missouri specifically where I am, they're thinking through a lot of that. It'd be interesting to hear your perspective there.
Absolutely. So a couple things just out the gate. One thing worth mentioning, if I haven't done it already, is the Wyoming stable token is issued by Wyoming as a sovereign entity, right? It is the state of Wyoming doing the issuance. It's not a Wyoming bank. It's not a Wyoming trust. It is the state. That means we are only realistically overseen by the federal government and whatever rules they have in place that would govern or oversee states. As it is written, it is not our opinion that the Genius Act is applicable to the Wyoming Stable Token Commission or a Wyoming stable token. That is due to how issuers are defined, particularly as people in the Genius Act. And people are banks, trusts, fintechs, and other business entities. Nowhere in there does it say state or sovereign entities. And for further clarity on that, I'm not intended, Chris Land, who is Senator Lummis's general counsel, also the staff director of the Senate Banking Subcommittee on Digital Assets, did testify in front of the Select Committee on Blockchain, which is the branch of the legislature that oversees us, that there is no expectation that the Stable Token Commission or a Wyoming stable token would be under the purview of the Genius Act. So that means it's very important for us to create our own rules. So first we have statute, right, law from the legislature. Then we have rules. We passed rules around reserves management. We put rules forward around token management. And then we have all of our policies and procedures, and we make all of those public for public comment and scrutiny, and we welcome that. Doubling back to the Genius Act itself, one key thing to notice while that is now signed, there's still rulemaking on behalf of the agencies that have been tagged in that document, particularly the SEC and some others. They have to go through an 18-month rulemaking process to put their own specificity in before this thing really gets fully promulgated. So I think you're still looking at a bit of a shot clock on this, but we've already made kind of a lot of progress from where we were, again, during the prior administration. So I think it's all net positive. And then I do have some concerns about the prohibition of yield-bearing stable tokens. I think it's an issue that you can create yield-bearing stable coins offshore that are backed by US debt. The interest payments on US debt are funded by taxpayers. So you can have a, offshore yield-bearing stable coin that's passing on interest from US debt, i.e. taxpayer dollars, to people outside the US, but those US taxpayers can't get their own taxpayer dollars back. And I think that is a fundamental problem with that prohibition. But we'll see if that sticks around. I mean, there's a lot of interest
Why
from
do
the
you think
banking
that was?
lobby.
That seemed like such a clear, like stake in the ground with the Genius Act. Was in your view that something that was, for me, I think a lot of this is like a foot in the door type of approach. Like, let's just get something on paper. Even when you're closing like a big commercial deal, it's like, what's the easiest way to just get started here and get something in, and then we can build and work through. And it sounds like, there are all these other ways now that that's starting to happen. Was in your mind payment stablecoins versus this other, yield bearing stablecoin stuff, more of that, like, hey, this is probably easier to pass, let's do this now? Or, what's your take there? It seems like such a specific thing to like put a stake in the ground with.
So first thing I'd note is I think you're absolutely correct on kind of the MVL, the minimum viable legislation, right? Would be the
I've never heard
would
that
be
before. Is that
I
a
just made
thing?
it up. No, I just made it up.
Love it. Minimum viable legislation. That's good.
I think it was the acute thing to do, and the right thing to do is to get the Stablecoin Act passed and be very targeted around that, right? A lot of work had been done already by Patrick McHenry and others. Lummis had the LGPSA, the Lummis Gillibrand Payment Stablecoin Act, right? So there's already work done on this particular topic. There's already momentum on this particular topic, and it was a specific thing you can legislate. There was in the lead up to Genius passing, I heard some rumblings, and this is not public information, right? But I heard rumblings that certain interest groups were trying to also push the market structure bill simultaneously or fold the stablecoin bill into a market structure bill and try to pass a whole omnibus thing at once. And there would be like no appetite for that because you're trying to do too many things. So I do think putting stablecoin legislation first and foremost was the right move. The second thing I would do is say you can certainly make the argument that the prohibition on yield-bearing stable tokens in the Genius Act is still a little bit open, and that openness does allow the SEC to come in and do their rulemaking as we had talked about. So you could make the argument that that's kind of why that was left as it was, and just delegating to agencies to do the job that they are responsible for and make responsible legislation or rules rather around that particular topic.
What does openness sound like specifically within the Genius Act? If you can be clear on that, I'm curious. Like maybe what is still open or not clearly defined that you think sets the stage for that sort of thing?
Well, we call it a prohibition, but it's similar to other parts of the Genius Act where, let's say, algorithmic stable coins are, right? Like they're not outright banned, but there's kind of like a moratorium. We're going to need like 2 years to look into this. That's it's kind of a little bit open in that way. I'm not going to be able to tell you that the exact statute off the top of my head. It's a little bit of a lengthy document that we focused on our own here in Wyoming. But what I will say is there's a lot of interest, is kind of the final point I was going to bring up, is there's a lot of interest from the banking lobby to close the loophole on the prohibition to make sure that's kind of like signed, sealed, and delivered. Like that is, there is no distribution of yield versus it's still being open to rulemaking by agency going forward.
Got it. Okay. So that's genius. It sounds like there's still, people think, oh, it's completed, it's done, we can move on. It's like, it sounds like this is more of a work in progress than maybe people might think. Like this is still something that can be refined, can be adapted, will pave the way for future legislation from what it sounds like in your view.
It's a strong line in the sand, right? Doing nothing, which was where we were kind of previously, right? Now we have a fairly robust piece of legislation. It defines who the issuers are, roughly what you can do, composition of reserves, defines what payment stablecoin is, which I think will have fairly big carry-on impacts to any rulemaking the IRS does around considering payment stablecoins as cash equivalents. So you wouldn't need to do tax reporting for every transaction you do with a stablecoin because it wasn't $1 flat. It was $0.9999999 per stablecoin at that very specific point in time. There's going to be these kind of knock-on impacts and cause and effect sequences that we'll see. But yeah, the work isn't done, but we've taken a pretty big stride in the right direction.
Yeah. So tell me a bit more around the Wyoming Stable Token Commission and how it's organized. It sounds like you were sort of running the ship as a sole contributor for a while. How is it organized? What is it like now? What's the team like? And specifically, what is the relationship formally between the state and that entity? It sounds like there's sort of like a separate powers there. Would love to know more about that.
In a way. So like I said, the Stable Token Act passed in March of 2023 after several permutations, right? It wasn't immediately passed in the format it's in. There was more oversight added, particularly around the structure of the commission. And to be clear, the chairman of the commission is the governor of the state of Wyoming, Mark Gordon. He's also flanked by state treasurer, Kurt Meyer, state auditor, Christy Racines. So there's a lot of oversight and transparency on this one, in addition to 4 other subject matter advisors who have been brought on as commissioners. One of those is Flavia Naves, who was formerly the general counsel at Circle, and Jeff Wallace from Wyoming Bank and Trust, so a local kind of community banking lens on everything we're doing. Joel Revel, who runs Two Ocean Trust, one of the first, if not the first, Bitcoin trust in the US, and David Pope, who runs DAP CPA, which is a local advisory firm, tax consultancy that focuses mostly on digital assets. So they kind of came together between May and July/August of 2023. I came on board in September of 2023 thereafter. So for a year, it was me and I had 7 bosses in terms of reporting into the commission, one of whom is the governor. But it's a great combination of people, right? I mean, the governor himself as the chairman, I mean, his background is entrepreneurial. He did a stint at the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City as a Class B director. So he's and he's signed the plurality of digital asset laws that have been passed in the state. He's been the one responsible for signing them. So you couldn't ask for really a better chairman. And then that's the commission. And I run, I guess, the agency, call it, just to kind of create that separation there. But that commission reports into what's called the Select Committee on Blockchain, Financial Innovation, and Digital Innovation Technology. It's a very long name. That is the branch of the Wyoming State Legislature, the whole thing, that oversees all the digital asset initiatives and anything that's in emerging tech. So I report into them. They meet several times a year. Again, all these meetings are public. So the Select Committee is meeting on the 22nd and 23rd of this month. I'll be testifying there. They're the ones who work on amendments to the laws. So if we wanted to update and amend the Stable Token Act, the legislature, the Select Committee be responsible for starting that process, then bringing it to the legislature in totality. I, as an appointed representative, I can't lobby any legislators, which makes things difficult because you have to kind of wait for them to come to you with questions before you could really respond and start that dialogue. So the best case scenario with that is working with the Select Committee to kind of put everything forward and say, hey, disseminate all this information as you see fit. In terms of the team itself, again, I was about solo for a year. Then we brought on Deborah Brooks as a Chief Risk and Compliance Officer. She joins us from the New York Department of Financial Services, where she was formerly the Deputy Virtual Currency Chief and Head of Supervision. Our CFO is Joe Saldana, Wall Street vet, who then went on to his own things. He's been in every, CCO, COO, CAO, CIO role. And he has, worked at one point to, as a kind of a fun side project, build oracles for real-time pricing data. Because he's like, we can't get correct pricing on these digital assets. So he built like his own oracles. Keith Lawhorn is our Chief Information Security Officer, tenure with everything from Homeland Security, Microsoft, himself at the Federal Reserve earlier in his career. So he's at the finance side, the technical side, the cybersecurity side. And then Steph Chan is our Senior Business Project Management Analyst, who comes with about 10 years of experience in the crypto space. And then the 5 of us have been running everything. And I don't want to be specific about the amount of work that's happening because this team works around the clock. We're responsible for everything. Most agencies have kind of like an overall remit and then several teams inside of them that, they do the tech, they do the HR stuff, they do whatever they're responsible for. Our team of 5 is responsible for everything. And there's no guidebook here. No one drops a binder on your desk and says, here's how the Wyoming state government works. Give this a read and just start hitting the buttons. there's a lot of just figuring it out on the fly, especially with such a niche agency that was staffed by one person for a year that many people didn't even know existed. So there's been a lot of challenges getting this thing really, where we wanted it to.
What's been the most unique challenge given that, like the tight knit group? It sounds like you have some really, really capable, amazing, talented people that you've brought into the fold here, but it's still like a Herculean vision and a small team. And again, like I think asking this in the lens of probably many other states and many other teams are thinking through something like this, like bring us into some of those core challenges and maybe some of the decisions that you guys have strategically made, like as we move more into like the infrastructure side of how this is all working too.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned infrastructure because I think procurement is the example there, right? So we knew with a team of 5 and a budget of less than $6 million, we knew we weren't going to hire 20 devs to build this from scratch. And what would be the point of doing that when we're now building and maintaining our own code and all of that? So the goal of the program has always been to recruit partners, vendors, with what we refer to as existing and demonstrable capabilities. So we had to do a whole procurement process to get that off the ground. But before we could even do the procurement process, we had to tighten the funnel a little bit and say, well, if we start a procurement process that doesn't specify which chain or chains we can build on, it's going to be this everybody, right? Kind of a free-for-all. So one of the first things we did, which we'd always be excited to get feedback on, is our blockchain selection exercise. Stood up a working group. Several of the commissioners were on it. The team members were on it. Several subject matter advisors from outside that whole apparatus were on it. And we came up with this list of, let's say, 30 chains, a list of 30 criteria. Said you had to pass these 5 criteria to kind of get scored. So, are you public and permissionless? Do you have permission to onboarding? Do you have, coverage from on-chain analytics firms? Can we do a freeze and seize on your platform, which, we need? And the Genius Act has, again, been very specific. You need that feature. Although I would argue our interdiction can only be downstream of valid court orders. We'll come back to that, but that is an important part of what it is we're doing.
What is freeze and seize for those not familiar?
So the ability for us to do any kind of interdiction over your tokens, right? So for us to freeze would be stop you from moving tokens around, and seize would be essentially our hand reaching into your wallet and pulling out the dollars. It's important to note that that is part of the Genius Act. It's important to note that that's how other issuers operate. And for those who say that we as a state are concerning because we're going to seize everybody's money, I would argue quite the opposite. If you look at the terms of service of other issuers, there's whole sections on prohibited activities and restricted transfers of what you can and can't do, many of which may be just downstream of the prevailing political or philosophical winds of the day. We were very specific to add into our user agreement, you can use a Wyoming Stable Token for any lawful use. Now we define the law, federal law, Wyoming law, your own jurisdiction. So you can't do things, like human trafficking. Like that's gonna be a problem if you try to pay for that with Wyoming Stable Tokens. But if it's lawful, then we're not going to do anything about it. And we can't do a freeze or seize unless it's downstream of a valid court order. So literally give me a warrant and we can act. Until then, I don't have the appropriate evidence to go and start freezing or seizing people's, tokens.
Okay. Bring us back then. So you're going through this process, you're looking at all these chains.
Right. So the point of that really is I would encourage other states to start getting their mind around how they can assess open source technology, because that's not going to fit into your state vendor process that's used to getting 2x4s and putting buildings together. Assessing open source tech is not part of that remit. So we did this whole thing built out in the open, again, with multiple commissioners, external parties, published the whole thing, let teams provide feedback on our scores. And we've made that into a quarterly exercise now on kind of rolling basis to ratify what we call candidate blockchains. And after we had the first cohort of candidate blockchains that we felt could support a Wyoming stable token at scale and retail use, then we transitioned to the procurement phase. We had to create all these RFQs, requests for qualification, RFPs, requests for proposal, and say, if you're doing the token issuance, you need to have these features. If you're doing the reserves management, you need to be a financial institution of this size, right? There's all these different complexities, but we're public with all of those, and those are all on our legacy website. We need to move them over to the new website, so we have that as a kind of a tombstone. But the point is we had to do a bit of a customized procurement process to make sure everyone was being assessed fairly. We weren't trying to assess every single blockchain-based provider ever. So we had to kind of tighten the funnel here and there, but we did it all through a public process that went through commission approval, was all well-informed, and is all, again, publicly disclosed on the homepage of our website.
What were you all ended up choosing Avalanche, correct? As the
We're
blockchain?
we're on 7 chains out the gate. We're interoperable.
Okay, cool. So what are the 7 that you decided to go with?
So we are on Avalanche, Ethereum, Solana, as well as Arbitrum, Base, Optimism, and Polygon as the layer 2s. So that's 7. 2 other candidate blockchains that initially passed our candidacy exercise were Stellar and Sui. And so we're looking to bring those on board as soon as some of our vendors that we now engage have the capacity to bring them on board. And then we've also since then brought on Say, Aptos, and Hedera. So again, we're going to start folding all these in over time. There'll be a process, right? Like, can we test it? Can we launch it? Right? Is it interoperable with everything? What's the liquidity look like? And then go from there to the next one. We're not going to launch, we've worked with layer 0. They're interoperable on 140 chains. We're not going to go on 140 chains tomorrow. That's a great way to, even though the interop kind of fixes the fragmented liquidity problem, that's still going to fragment your liquidity. So we're being quite deliberate around which chains we launch on and how. But as a state, I know we're talking about the procurement process where almost definitionally you have to pick winners, bus exercise to find the right partners. We're not really in the business of picking winners. So we have a remit from that select committee on blockchain, again, that branch of the legislature that oversees us, to be multi-chain and tech agnostic. Now, the thought was through the procurement piece, interoperability was not really a cornerstone of that. That was like a nice to have in like the token issuance RFP that we did. I personally had kind of assumed we'd be launching on one chain, then kind of just slowly but surely spreading out. But layer 0 had a bid that was strong enough that they came out in the top spot and they are interoperable out the gate. And that's where we are now. So yeah, we are on 7 chains from day one, and we will continue scaling from there.
Awesome. So you mentioned layer 0. What are some of these other core pieces or core pillars of actually bringing this frontier token to life? What are some of those core pieces of infrastructure or partners that you guys have selected or chosen to go with, or use cases that you have in mind when you're bringing the stable token to life?
Yeah, so just be quick on like the vendor side. The way I would think about it is you need to think the full life cycle of a stable token. So I typically refer to those as development, deployment, and ongoing management. That's everything from smart contract issuance through companies like Layer 0, private key management, and kind of backend infrastructure from Fireblocks. So that's where we kind of manage all of our smart contracts from. Reserves management, who's holding, who's investing the dollars into treasuries, who's managing the custody of all that. We brought in Franklin Templeton for that. On-chain analytics and open source intelligence, Chainalysis and Inca, to make sure that nefarious actors are not using a Wyoming Stable Token. And then kind of some of the other piece on the financial side, right? Internal controls from Ernst & Young, the network firm we brought on for financial audit and attestation. I feel like that's one position where we could potentially be a leader. I want to move us towards real-time attestation pretty quick. The network firm's got a widget that allows you to do that. Essentially just indexes all the chains that you're on, pulls in the supply of now the Frontier stable token in real time, pulls in an API from your bank. Are you over collateralized or not at every 30 seconds? And I think that that's going to be a best practice for the industry in the near future. And I hope we're one of the first to have it.
The network firm is the attestation partner there?
Yeah, correct.
It's really interesting because most of these issuers, they will do this on a monthly basis or quarterly basis, right? You're saying we would want to do this on a minute by minute basis almost.
Why not, right? To be clear, it's not going to be day one for us. We need some time to get spun up, get the token out, start doing the monthly reports kind of a standard way, put out our own. Again, this is not what any other, to my knowledge, agency in the state has to do, but put out our balance sheet, income statement of cash flows on a monthly basis. We're trying to be as open and transparent about this as possible, right? So put all those financials out month to month. And at the first couple of months, 3 or 4 months, we'll have kind of those monthly attestations. But again, the goal for me going forward is real-time attestation because, Drew, why not, right? The blockchain's real-time, APIs are real-time. What's stopping us from doing that? And I think people in our industry should be demanding more answers like that, because things will start to move faster and become more robust and more trustworthy if the transparency of this technology is used in the way it's been developed rather than just tied to tradition, like the traditional, here's our monthly report. Like, great, but you can do it real time too, so why not?
It seems like an old way of doing things that should be thought through how we can update that a little bit. I'll look at the network firm. I know that this company was mentioned, and I'm really bullish generally just on this part of the stack. Like I know attestations are required now with the Genius Act, and companies like this are just positioned so well to ride the wave.
Well, they're independent from us, right? They're a financial audit attestation. You got to be arm's length. You got to be independent. So let you do your own research on that. But that is who we've brought on. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just make all my disclaimers now because I didn't say at the beginning that everything is my opinion.
I need to do better at that too. And then where does Rain fit into all of this on the card side?
So we've announced Rain as one of our early partners for the actual distribution of the Frontier Stable Token. And I want to be very clear, it's probably talking all over the vernacular, right? You hear that I'm still using Wyoming Stable Token. That's because that's been defined as essentially a type of stable token, right? That could be deployed repeatably. It's got this kind of reserves composition, these reserves management rules behind it, token management rules, these policies, procedures, user agreements. There could be many Wyoming stable tokens, right? There could be a yield-bearing Wyoming stable token. The Frontier is just the first one that we've issued, right? So that's how that's gone out the gate. But we're excited about the partnership with Rain and Avalanche because that's going to be, it's my opinion and perspective that to scale this technology, you're going to need people to be able to use familiar form factors to use it, right? Which is why the Rain card, having a smart card like that you can tap to pay and use as you would, is going to be very impactful because you could tie it to your typical Visa rails, but you could also use Wyoming stable tokens. So having that kind of out the gate, having it on a very scalable and efficient and low-fee network like Avalanche is critical, although they're also interoperable with a number of the chains that we're on at this point. And I think having it as a instrument, you could leverage the 150 million existing Visa terminals, as well as the Google Pay and Apple Pay rails out the gate, is going to be a needle mover for us in the very immediate future.
Last couple of questions. I know we're coming up here on time. I feel like we're just now getting to the juicy stuff. But like one, just what is the use case? I think that's something that the state senator was like really just trying to be clear with me is like, what is the use case that this enables? Or like who is going to be receiving these things? How is that going to be faster, better, cheaper, more convenient? Like in your mind, what are some of these core folks in Wyoming, how are they actually going to get involved with this? How does that come to life practically in your mind?
Yeah, so it's important to quickly note that the Frontier Stable Token is meant for global use, right? It's not limited to the four corners of Wyoming. We don't have enough people in the state to make that economically viable, right? So this is meant to be a global product, so domestic, international, DeFi. I'd point you to two quick examples. One is we had a demo, because we've been doing pilot programs with the Frontier Stable Token. We had a demo performed by the team over at Hashfire, which is another organization, Wyoming domiciled, building on Avalanche, that does contract automation similar to DocuSign, and then automated payment of vendor invoices following those approvals. So one of the things we struggle with is sometimes it takes a long time to get invoices processed, right? It's a 45-day statutory process in the state. With Hashfire, we can automate all the approvals and vendor payments and shorten that down to about 45 seconds, right? So when you think about efficiencies that could be had just from state government using this itself, saying nothing of actual purchase by, just John Q. Public, there's already a lot of room to move there. And then people who saw that demo that was presented, one of the local papers, the Cowboy State Daily, ran with that as an example for emergency aid distribution in the state. So last year, around this time, we had about 850,000 acres burning between northern Wyoming and Montana. And when you have fires of that scale, you need to deploy volunteers, first responders. They need equipment. They need to lease equipment. They need supplies. They need water. All that needs to be contracted and paid for by the state. So if we've got a way to do that now in the course of a few minutes versus a month and a half, this is a tectonic change that this technology can facilitate. And again, that's even just using it kind of within the confines of the state itself. Another one I'll give you is one of the county treasurers in the state reached out over the weekend, noting that they collected $3.4 million of tax revenues, whatever the number was, right, last year. And that collection of revenues cost Wyoming citizens $70,000 in credit card processing fees. So if we are putting this all on chain and those fees become a fraction of a cent, then we don't have that onus. Now, one more, so there's a number of ways to integrate this well into your own public operations, saying nothing of the transparency and other benefits that it garners. And the last thing I'll say is, since launching this token and the attention we're getting from states, nation states, governments abroad, NGOs, I'm very pleased with their interest in what we're building. because this thing was never meant to go up against Circle or Tether and compete for private, against private interests. What I think we could do is be the public stable token of choice. There's a lot of, aid distribution organizations that have begun reaching out that are extremely interested and moving, frontier stable tokens, moving value from our organization or their organization directly to an aid recipient, especially in the wake of US aid being dismantled, finding out that perhaps 88% of every dollar that was intended for aid distribution was being kind of skimmed off the top before it got to the ultimate recipient. We have the ability to transmit 100%. And I think there's going to be a lot of interest in doing that kind of work with the Frontier Stable Token and what we're building in Wyoming, than rather than having, us compete against private interests, which is not really the goal here, nor are.
Last question for you. It's awesome. As you really are now in this position of like being riding the frontier, pioneering this, I get really excited of like the learnings that you've garnered, the experience that you've had doing this specifically with Wyoming. What would be the invitation or the words of wisdom or call to other people around the US or more broadly who are now in this position of wanting to consider doing something similar? What would you kind of encourage them with or say to them? It sounds like a lot of these folks are already getting in touch with you. Maybe we can land the plane with that.
Yeah. So a couple things. One, I would just note quickly is, while the token is technically, deployed, we haven't opened up the public sale yet. The goal for that is September 18th. So just a few weeks away. That's our next commission meeting. And the hope is to have the token available for purchase at that point, and some of our partners join us during that conversation to show how that can all work. But taking a step back and kind of opening the doors to other states, nations, NGOs, we're having all those discussions. We're open for business. I would note that Wyoming to get here took about 10 years of legislation, 2 years of building, a year of procurement, years of we had to do our own rulemaking. Well, on one hand, we built everything open and someone could kind of just take what we've done and turnkey it. Good luck if you're doing it on your own. You need a very supportive legislature and the right leadership and the right team to build it. If you want to work with us, we're open for business. We were pretty clear that we're exploring interstate compacts. So we announced this thing on the 19th of last month. By the 20th, we're already having sit-downs about interstate compacts with leadership.
What does that mean?
The ability for Wyoming to partner with other states where they can adopt because we're not governed necessarily by a federal purview, states can come together and say, we're going to use Wyoming's law, rules, policies, tech stack, and just kind of turnkey deploy a Wyoming stable token. We'll call it a different thing. We'll have the Frontier Stable Token. Another state could have another thing. But we could figure out what a revenue share could look like. We could figure out what the reserves measurement looks like. Generally speaking, we've built the framework. Why would we not try to make public entities all over the state? Why would we not try to make aid distribution globally more efficient, transparent, feasible, equitable? Put your adjective behind it. We could probably pull it off.
Yeah, it's kind of a tip of the cap to the old LLC form. It reminds me of that in a way of like coming in, we have the framework, like just use this thing. It's really cool. Well, Anthony, thank you for this. Thank you just for the time and all the work that you've been doing. It's such an exciting few weeks for you guys that it's been many, many years in the making. So we'll have to do this again soon, and we'll continue following and covering all of the amazing work you and your team are doing.
Thank you, Drew. It's been a pleasure. Much more to come from our side, so stay in touch and we'll be talking soon. Thank you.
Cool. And I mean that too. We would love to what was the last thing you said? I'll clip it there, but the compact or whatever. What's the
interstate compact?
Interstate
right.
compact.
I mean, that's where a bunch of states can come together and say we're all going to opt into this model and just use what they've already built rather than trying to create our own.
Are you guys okay? We're thinking through some like educational series courses, like using lead funnels in this way. Would be really interested to knowing that's a thing, work with you on creating some stuff like that could maybe market or like get the right people. Because you're probably feeling this way. Like there's so many people knocking on the door. Banks also like separately, but like states and
credit
we
unions.
need to figure out a way to co-create content for those types of people. And just like, hey, go take this course, go through this like system, and then come out the other side and you'll be ready to have the conversation. So we're thinking through how we can be a vessel to go create that in partnership with people like you guys. So maybe we can talk more about that, but I don't want to keep you any longer. I know we're over.
No, it's all good. If we're going to kill the recording real quick, I've got one more comment for you.
Yeah. Hold on. All right.